Okay, so hopefully you've now had a chance to think about what some of the potential applications and issues with sentiment analysis might be. So here are some things that I came up with for potential applications. So we might be able to use sentiment analysis to automatically classify service user survey data, for example. We could use it to analyse reviews of things like movies, books. We could use it to analyse social media posts and automatically flag up negative comments to be addressed. That sounds very sinister, but I meant that in a positive way, not to go out and shoot them. And to help look for positive or negative references to your organisations on websites, etc. So there's clearly lots of potential applications for this kind of stuff, and I'm sure within all organisations, at least one of those potential applications will be really useful. But let's think about some of the challenges of sentiment analysis as well. So let's start with one consideration here. Let's analyse these three sentences. Sentence 1. I loved having to wait for 5 hours to see a doctor. Sentence 2. I was extremely impressed. I'd never seen a restaurant with more dirt per square inch. And sentence 3. Well done. You managed to ignore every request for help. Quite an achievement. Now, I think most of us would likely consider that whoever said those three things was probably being a bit on the sarcastic side. But there's a real issue when we come to sentiment analysis because, by its very nature, these examples show positive language, and so a machine may well find it difficult to identify that these are not actually positive statements, that the person didn't actually love having to wait for 5 hours to see a doctor, that they weren't actually impressed with the cleanliness of the restaurant, and they were unimpressed with the way in which their request for help was ignored. But it's really difficult for machines to be able to pick that up. And if we think about it, that shouldn't be surprising, because even as human beings, we sometimes struggle to identify when people are being sarcastic, particularly when it's in written form. So just take a moment just to reflect on why you think the above sentences are sarcastic. Why do you think they're sarcastic? Try and think about why you're, as a human, picking up that this doesn't sound right, it sounds sarcastic. Just pause the video for a minute. Just think about what your thought processes are and how you're coming to those conclusions. So there is something called sarcasm detection. And sarcasm detection is a branch of natural language processing that tries to use AI-based methods to learn whether a particular piece of text is sarcastic in tone. And the way in which sarcasm analysis tends to work, and really the most effective way of trying to identify sarcasm, is to compare a statement with known truths. So, for example, if we take the statement, I loved having to wait for 5 hours to see a doctor, but we also know that people don't tend to like to wait for services, then we can conclude that the statement, I loved having to wait for 5 hours to see a doctor, is unlikely to be true, and therefore may be sarcasm. So that sounds great in principle, but as you might imagine, sarcasm detection, trying to be able to compare in that way to try and find the known truths and compare them is not trivial. And so sarcasm detection is actually really, really hard. And if you start looking into it, you'll see how hard this stuff is. So a likely better solution, practically speaking, if you're worried about sarcasm, is to take samples of your data and determine the percentage of cases that seem to be demonstrating sarcasm. In the majority of cases, you're likely to find, unless you've got a very sarcastic service user base, that it's likely to be trivial. It's probably more of a problem, in particular on social media, than it is, for example, on things like crew observations or survey data. But nonetheless, it can be a problem. So it's more a case of being aware of it. I would urge you, though, to check out a website called thesarcasmdetector.com. It is highly worth checking that out and putting in some phrases. It'll try and detect whether you're being sarcastic using neural network-based approaches in the back end. And it's not bad. It's you'll see that it's not great, and it's because sarcasm detection is so hard. But it is a lot of fun to play around with. So do give that a try. There's another challenge though, not related to sarcasm. Let's think about the following fictional data from a patient survey question. Let's say the question was, what did you feel about your stay in the hospital? Now, that's the kind of open-ended question that you might expect to see quite commonly on patient survey data. Let's imagine this fictional response, and I want you to think about whether you would rate this response as positive, negative, or neutral, and why you would do that. So let's imagine the response is, the care from the staff was absolutely fantastic, they made me feel safe, and nothing was too much trouble. But when I was discharged and had to wait over 5 hours for my prescribed medications at the pharmacy, this is atrocious. So have a think, just pause the video for a moment and just have a little think about how you would rate that. Would you rate that review as positive, negative, or neutral, and why would you do that? So just take a couple minutes, and then when you're ready, resume the video. So the reason why this is difficult is because clearly there are both positive and negative elements to the above review. So if we were to consider the overall review as positive, then what we're essentially doing is we're assuming that the care from the staff was more important to the person who wrote this review than the wait at the pharmacy, because we're saying that review is positive and the thing they talked positively about was the care from the staff. So that's more important if we're saying this review is positive. If we rate it as negative, then we've got the opposite problem. What we're saying, we're necessarily assuming that the wait at the pharmacy was more important to the reviewer than the care from the staff. So the overriding review was negative. So it might be tempting to say, well, let's classify this review as neutral then, because there's both positive and negative. But even in doing that, we have a potential issue, because we are still necessarily making an assumption. In this case, we're making the assumption that both aspects are weighted equally, such that their overall feelings about their stay in the hospital are considered neither positive nor negative. And that may not be true either. It may be that they felt more strongly about one of those things, but that there's no evidence to support that. So what can we do? Because actually, we can see this is probably going to be a pretty common problem. So what I want you to do is to take a few moments now, maybe the next 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes, just spend thinking about what we might do to try and get over this problem, which is likely going to be quite a common problem. Again, feel free to bounce some ideas around on Slack. Once you're ready to move on to the next video.